Hi, this is Stuart Weems and welcome to the Investopoly podcast. My goal is to give you simple, easy to understand strategies, insights and tips to help you master the game of building wealth. And in this episode, I'd like to talk about borrowing capacity and the changes that APRA made 2 weeks ago, and as a result, some changes that both ANZ and Westpac made last week in respect to their benchmark interest rate. Before I get into that, it's really interesting to note that the banks have been relatively silent about the government's crackdown on borrowing capacity and what they call prudential lending standards over the last couple of years, particularly around the Royal Commission. And I guess that's of no surprise because the banks certainly didn't want to attract too much attention, nor did they want to seem like they're pushing back on tighter lending standards when they had very loose, I guess, ethical standards as a result of the financial advice that they've been providing over the past few decades, as highlighted by the Royal Commission. So naturally, the banks wanted to sort of keep out of the limelight and just go along with the government. However, that seems to be changing now. In fact, ASIC will hold some public hearings next month where the banks will be able to provide some feedback in relation to ASIC's and APRA's changes or prudential regulation in respect to borrowing capacity. And the banks have already submitted written submissions in relation to that. And really they've described the tightening as impractical, anti-competitive and potentially damaging to the economy, I quote. So it's an interesting sign, I think, and enough time. They must feel like enough time has elapsed between the Royal Commission and now. The Royal Commission is somewhat old news, I guess, and the banks want to get back to lending, and they're sort of pushing back on the government to say, look, it's been a bit heavy-handed, which I think it has, which I'll talk about in a second. So what happened? 2 weeks ago, APRA told the banks they no longer have to use a minimum benchmark interest rate of 7.25% when testing someone's borrowing capacity. So if you're going to apply for a loan, even though the loan's interest rate might be in the threes, the bank will test your ability to repay that loan at 7.25% on a P&I, principal interest basis, over a 25-year period if you're applying for an interest-only loan. So the actual repayments are more than twice. The assessed repayments of that loan are more than double what the actual repayments might be. And that impacts on your borrowing capacity. And the banks have argued and commentators have argued that 7.25% is a bit ridiculous given where interest rates are now and that they're trending lower, and most people expect them to be lower for longer. As a result, both ANZ and Westpac said that they will adopt a different benchmark interest rate equal to 2.5% above the current interest rate. And that's going to have an impact of improving borrowing capacity. So a lender will, as I said, when a lender calculates borrowing capacity, essentially what they do is add up all your income, less expenses, and as long as there's a surplus income, they'll approve the loan. So employment income, is pretty obvious. They'll take it off your pay slip and look at the year-to-date amount. Rental income, they will typically include 70-80% of that to make an allowance, a 20 to 30% allowance for expenses. Living expenses, which I'll talk about in a second, but you have to declare what you spend, and the bank will then trawl over your bank statements for the last 3 months to verify that that is in fact what you spend. If you have credit card limits, the bank will multiply the total limits by 3.8%, and that is your monthly expense. So if you've got a $15,000 credit card, even though it's got a zero balance, the assumed repayment on that card, if it was fully utilised, is $570 a month. So credit card limits really eat into, and more so than ever before because of changes in the way the government's directed banks to treat credit cards. And then mortgages, as I said, the loan amount times the benchmark interest rate over typically a 25-year period if the loan is interest only, 30 if it's not. and that's the repayments. And so it's the living expenses plus the credit card plus the mortgage repayments. That's your total expenses. If that is less than income, great. If it's more than income, forget about it. You've got no borrowing capacity. So I did an analysis to see, okay, what impact will the changes that Westpac and ANZ made, what impact will it have on borrowing capacity? And it was really interesting. And what I did is I obviously used the same inputs, the same sort of client case study or example across all the big four lenders to calculate what surplus borrowing capacity this particular example had. And Westpac's borrowing capacity increased in this example by about 8%, from 815,000 to 880,000. So reasonable. ANZ, however, its change had a much larger impact and it increased by 20%. So in this case, the client could borrow $900,000, whereas prior to this change, prior to last week, it was $750,000. So a pretty significant uplift there. Now, the reason why Westpac was lower is because Westpac made some changes to their minimum living expense amount as well. So essentially, Westpac gave with one hand and took with the other by saying, here's a lower benchmark interest rate, but by the way, we're going to assume you spend a lot more money. By comparison, so really that's Westpac 880, ANZ 900. By comparison, CBA is at 800 and NAB is at 770. So really the range is NAB at the low end 770, ANZ at the high end of the range at 900, a 17% difference in borrowing capacity. Pretty significant, right? Which sort of tells us that we certainly need to compare a number of different lenders. Now, don't conclude that ANZ's borrowing capacity is always higher than NAB, for example. There's so many variations in policy and calculation and individual client situations that it might not always be the case. But the theme of the analysis is that, okay, the changes have had a really positive impact on borrowing capacity, and what we really need, and borrowing capacity varies significantly between all the lenders, and so you really need to have a thorough assessment on an individual case-by-case basis to work out who is the best lender for a given particular client. Benchmark interest rates reducing the benchmark interest rate is good. I mean, it's good news for borrowers, particularly borrowers that currently have a lot of lending. If you don't have a lot of existing lending, then the benchmark interest rate's going to not have too much of an impact for you. But if you've got a lot of lending, it's going to be very positive. But the real problem lies in living expenses. And that is that the banks don't distinguish between discretionary and non-discretionary expenses. So, for example, if you eat out every week and you spend $200 at a restaurant, for example, the bank's going to assume you've got an annual commitment of $10,000 a year. And as a result of that increased annual commitment, your borrowing capacity reduces by around about $130,000. Now, of course, that's nonsensical, because if you experience cash flow pressure, you'd either reduce the regularity, reduce the spend, or completely eliminate it. So perhaps what the banks should be doing is including 100% of non-discretionary items like utilities and food and insurance. These are the sorts of things we have to pay for. And then when it comes to discretionary items, maybe they shouldn't include 100%. Maybe they should shade it and include, say, 50%. To make allowances for the fact that it is, in fact, discretionary. And eating out is not a financial commitment. And so I think there needs to be a little bit of loosening or common sense when it comes to assessing a client's living expenses. Remember, the bank will go through your bank statements to ascertain how much you're spending. And there's not a lot of leniency there as well. So what I did, which you'll find in the show notes, is I charted the volume of new lending versus changes in property prices since 2002, when the data set began, to try and ascertain what impact credit flows have on property prices. Is there a direct correlation, or does it have zero impact? And interesting to note, I mean, adjusted the amounts for the impact of inflation, but interesting to note that really credit flows have been relatively volatile over that period of time since 2002, ironically when I started ProSolution. Credit flows range really from 15 to 25 billion per month. That's coming in and out of the property market. And you can see this chart, as I said, we've got a link in the show notes and on the blog on the website. And you can see that there isn't, whilst there's not a direct, well, there's probably a quite close direct relationship for the last 5 years, but certainly before that, there is a relationship, but not a perfect correlation. So I think the easing in credit will undoubtedly help the property market and help increase prices. Just the flow of new money coming to the market does that. But there's other things at play as well that we need to make sure that consumer sentiment is also sort of strong and buoyant, and there's other things that impact property price growth. Interesting to note that the media has written about the improvement in auction clearance rates. At the beginning of this year, clearance rates in Melbourne and Sydney were close to 50%. More recently, they've increased to 75%, sort of in that range. But there's very few transactions. From a new listing, so a property number perspective, new listings are down by 30% over the past 12 months. And from a value perspective, in Melbourne, for example, 138 million of property changed hands last weekend, well below the peak market volume of $1 billion. So any one weekend in a very buoyant market, $1 billion of property would change hands. So it's really less than 14% of that amount. So I don't place a lot of weight on the clearance rate, although it is a positive signal. It's very difficult to get a true sense of the market on such low volume data. And I think the spring market should be a good test. So if vendors start to feel the market's turned, maybe more discretionary vendors will say, okay, I want to sell my property and put it on the market and increase stock levels. And then it'd be interesting to see, is there enough buyer demand to not only soak up those stock levels, but create some price growth. One last warning is that the market can change quickly. I'm not saying it will change quickly, but it can change quickly. And prices can jump significantly from one weekend to the next for ostensibly very similar properties in similar areas. And it's difficult to ascertain for inexperienced buyers whether that move is permanent or not. And if the price movement is in fact permanent, and you don't change and adjust your own expectations accordingly, it could cost you a lot more in the long run. So that is, you'll be sitting on the sidelines, and by the time you realise prices have changed, they've probably changed again. So that's where it's really important, in my opinion, to be advised by a reputable and experienced buyer's agent that's going to look after your best interests and have a much better sense of what the market is doing, and make sure they adjust quickly enough, because any delay could cost you way more than what a buyer's agent might charge you in terms of fees. So there you go, positive news in terms of borrowing capacity and hopefully loosening lending. It'll be interesting to see what the public hearings that ASIC are running next month reveal. But let's hope it's a little bit more of a common sense approach, particularly in respect to living expenses. Of course, if you've got any questions about borrowing capacity or what I've covered, don't hesitate to reach out to us. The links are in the blog on the website. And until next week, bye for now.